Hello, and thank you for coming. Sorry I can't be there in person as I'm on a course in Leeds today. But as a brief overview, I'm currently 18 months through in the full-time route, so I thought it was a good point to reflect on different methods I've used in my PhD, what I've learned from them, and how my questions and methods have changed. It's also important for me that my methods synthesise together, so I can make the case that I'm using mixed methods rather than just multi-methods. These aren't just lots of small projects and similar topics, it's actually something that builds up over time. So hopefully you'll find this helpful if you're planning your data collection, or you're thinking about mixed methods, or if you think about numerical data, because I've kind of learned a bit more about that. So all this started, I was teaching a preparatory course at Corpus Christi in Cambridge, and they have the system of one-on-one weekly meetings throughout your undergraduate course. They call it the supervision system. And during that you'd stand there, read your essay in front of a professor, and then have a conversation about it every week. And I thought this was great. The whole system was so far away from my undergraduate experience. But when I talked to colleagues who were Cambridge graduates, their opinions were pretty mixed. One comment stood out, that they never really figured out how they could get a first. One of them said to me it was just a 2-1 plus magic. It was all down to just a bit of luck, really. So we had this system which sounds brilliant. It's completely unaffordable to most universities, but it still had problems. And in fact I went and compared National Student Survey data between the English department at the college and the one where I studied, which was here, St Martin's. And the St Martin's course actually scored higher on quite a lot of these measures. So I was really interested in this idea of why the system wasn't as amazing as it sounded. And it got me thinking about teacher training. I trained as an English teacher, and during that I had really good supervision with weekly meetings, lots of one-on-one feedback. I'd watch my mentor teach, they'd watch me, we'd talk about it afterwards. But again, there was this sense that you didn't really know if you're performing at the top grade or not. So I wondered how people felt about this who didn't do particularly well. And this was a friend of mine had really mixed bag of experiences. Sometimes she was outstanding, she actually failed one placement and then got her QTS with top grades like 2 months later. So it was really all over the place. And when we were talking about that, there was this strong sense of, well, it was a bit of luck. There was maybe a bit of bias on the mentor. It was just an unfair situation, or the class wasn't suitable. But she also focused quite a lot on her own deficiencies. So there was an attribution theory angle on this. Do you put this down to environmental factors, or is it down to things that are wrong with you? So I think it would be useful to speak to students who've gone through this experience, the ones who are going to give poor satisfaction ratings, which the university is interested in, and were there any common features? Was this luck? Was this related to the individual? Or were these things that we could predict and maybe even fix? So there was a risk of bias here because I'd gone through this training, I knew a lot of people who had failed it, and I thought the interviews probably wouldn't be the best starting point. If I was choosing the questions, choosing a direction in the interview, then coding the results in a grounded approach, it'd probably be tough to keep objective and rigorous on that. I might just see kind of what I expected to see. So I started with textual analysis. I went to the TES forums, where the trainee teachers have a separate forum, and I just searched for feedback. Every time feedback was mentioned, opened that page and pasted everything into a Word document. This gave me 56 pages of data, 33,000 words from 93 trainees. So let me show you an example of the coding. You probably can't read this too clearly, but you can see how I'm trying to just get down to the facts of it. What happened? How did they feel? So the text here starts some positive interactions. Then there's a focus on the unfairness and consistency. There's a suddenness in the mentor's behaviour. And there's a tension now between this and the previous paragraph where there was a problem, there was this feedback conversation, really good practice, everyone said what they meant, and the problem was solved. But then that doesn't match up with what actually happened, the behaviour doesn't match the rhetoric. So then we've got how the trainee coped. In this case, they felt they just had to accept it, be compliant, be respectful, and now the whole experience that they're reflecting on is kind of a write-off because of this one-off event. So there's a lot of learning missed there. And from looking at all these other ones from the 93 students who commented on this area, there's this sense of randomness and luck. You're generally given placements just based on where you live and how convenient it is to get there, or how far you've travelled previously, and there wasn't much sense that it was tailored to the individuals at all. So some people thought, oh well, they had a rough time last time, so I'll get an easier one next time. But really, it was random. It was luck, and I could relate to this a bit. My own experience was a lot easier, I think, than a lot of people I knew. I got kind of middle classy school places that liked subject knowledge, didn't have behaviour management issues, so my training didn't have much variety to it. And I could see how, if I'd gone to a certain school, I might have really struggled. So, from this, one of the limitations, obviously, is these trainees are out of sample. They're a small number. This is 93 across the whole country. And they probably have a bit of an axe to grind. So, you don't go to an online forum to say how well everything is going and how happy you are with your training. Not usually. So, I needed to contextualise these ideas. I wanted a fresh sample, trainees who were happy, weren't happy, everyone's doing, the whole range. So, was there a common experience of the trainees who had bad experiences, or were some of these elements shared? How much of it was luck? How much could you predict? And were there situations in which anyone would struggle, or were you kind of the maker of your own destiny? So, made a survey, and because I didn't want any element of self-selection in the sample, I went to a lecture and handed this out in paper. So it was voluntary, but when you have a piece of paper in front of you, you've got 5 minutes to fill it in. Most people did. In fact, everyone did it. So an interesting point here, if you look at some of this is an example of one of the questions, which is just, why do you think problems do come up on placement? And what was interesting is trainees did mostly recognise that they could be part of the problem. And there was this idea that there's another type of trainee who's worse than them. And you can always imagine, it's like we always think that there must be someone who drinks more wine than we do in a night. But there's always someone who behaves worse. But what also came out is there wasn't much of an understanding of why things would go wrong, and this kind of made sense with how many trainees said things started out really well and how things suddenly went badly. So we could see what was bad after the fact, but beforehand, when you're in your first few weeks, probably not. Although there were, of course, still some cases where that first meeting or visit day was absolutely disastrous and nothing ever improved from there. Another interesting result I got was dissatisfaction among students who had the highest grades. So, by and large, the higher grade you get, the happier you are. But there was a distinct group of students who did really well, but they got exactly what they needed from the assessment in terms of their grade, but they absolutely didn't get what they wanted in terms of their learning. And this led me to think about values. So it's well established assessment has a problem with students looking for leverage or shortcuts or trying to game the system. But what happens in something like teaching, nursing, where you've got this strong sense of vocation? Most of the courses we get into, we have this strong sense of drive and vocation behind it. So if you just want to learn as much as you can, does the assessment regime support that? Is it kind of ambivalent towards it, or is it a bit of a hindrance? So, new title, how is feedback for learning understood and experienced in school-based teacher education? So this was a concept of feedback which is not to do with getting on with your mentor or figuring out what to do with the assessment. It's all focused on this very deep, transformative learning idea. So, methods here are very different because I was starting to think in a more numerical sense, and I wanted to state my case more confidently and to people who that sort of thing mattered to. And I was also kind of struggling with my position as a researcher because I was getting interested and convinced that there's something about tacit knowledge here. There's something that people weren't saying or couldn't quite say. So how much could I allow the data to speak for itself? How much was I happy to put an interpretation on it? And was I even happy to say that students wrong and arguing that I kind of know their experience better than they do? So that didn't really fit in with the social constructivist approach I'd been with before. Divine orthodoxy is a term Silverman uses, and that's the tension here. So I read a bit more mixed methods, and I was sitting comfortably with David Plowright's book, and it's still a little bit ad hoc, and I found it tough to be convincing, really. And even at transfer, I had to talk this out a bit more. But I was feeling more and more confident with it. I looked up Nigel Ketley had a useful text on it as well. I'd read some philosophy texts and Thomas Reid, and I was using less well-known theorists' philosophical foundations, but I was also confident that they linked to the better-known approach, which Plowright has a book on. So I was happy with this theoretical framework of feedback for learning, and data collection analysis had this distinction now between understood and experience. So that ties in now with this idea of assessment literacy. So these trainees will become teachers. Do they learn how to be good assessors through their training, or do they not really see that there's a link between how they learn and how they teach? So it's back to this idea again of gameplay, and do they know what's best for them as learners, and even when they do, is that free from the problems of getting through the day job? It's a very demanding training. So this time I started with a survey instead of starting with interviews, and they came from the literature. So I had 3 different surveys, and I kind of mined them for relevant items. And I used statistical inference and factor reduction, factor analysis to try and get this data to speak for itself a bit. So I've already got some interesting results. I'm really pleased with them because to me they feel now more objective in the sense that I haven't shaped them, and they're generating patterns of response which link to the literature but also expand on it. So if I show you this next slide, you can see that the survey is a bit cleaner and simpler to use than the last one I had. And you get, this came out of the factor analysis, I've called it concept widening. So this concept I came up with from the data analysis is on the left, and the columns are concepts from the literature. And you can see that this concept that dropped out has a lot to do with concepts of dialogue and specific feedback, and it's got a little bit of general feedback in there. So what really came out of this was this linking of the values the trainees had and what they did with their feedback. So that was really interesting, the way it was linking to the literature but also showing some interrelations and expanding on it a bit. What was also really interesting was that there's not much difference in these factors based on which university you go to. I sampled 4-year groups, all the undergrads at 2 universities, and there wasn't that much difference. You get a little bit more strategic as you go through the course. One of the universities was a bit more suited to deep learning than the other, but the most interesting result here was that there wasn't this difference, and training wasn't actually having this massive impact. So my next phase, which I'm just starting now, is to see how some of these beliefs develop and why it's not picked up in the survey tool. So are these beliefs from the trainee, from their university experience, from the in-school training, from when they were kids at school, or what's going on? and I want to get more into this idea of tacit information. So I'm not as interested in self-report because I've got that in the survey, or prompted responses because they were in the survey. So I'm wanting to get away from rehearsed stories or anecdotes and things like that. So I'm using repertory grid technique and biographic narrative interviews, and both of these have this idea that the participants taking the lead a bit, but it's preventing these over-rehearsed stories. It's really foregrounding spontaneous data generation. So the question technique, for example, in biographic narrative interviews, it's always trying to uncover new specific information. It's pushing for these very specific examples. It rejects member checking. It doesn't want you to reflect on it afterwards and redact things or change things. It really wants this focus on spontaneous production and equally impartial analysis using different people to analyse it. So this is helping now this original concern I had about claiming to know more than they do. So I'm starting to feel more confident in this analytical role. So that's where I am now. I have a lot of self-report data with a strong link to literature. I've got a systematic objective, or at least numerical analysis, which is showing the concepts from the literature are useful and that they differentiate between different types of trainees. And I think I can also show now where feedback has problems, both in general and for particular types of trainee. And I'm showing how the literature can be expanded and make some links between it. And I think I'm also now striking this balance between being rigorous and also letting my trainees have a voice and express their concepts without being too critical. So I'm looking at how these concepts are formed, I'm stripping it back, and I'm getting into a bit more of the psychology and sociology of the experience rather than just its impact. So I think the interviews give a really nice bridge to this. It's looking at the concepts, their effects, and then the actual experience of the individual. So I'm feeling quite confident now that I've really got a mixed methods approach, but I would of course love to hear what you think about it, and it's still an ongoing anxiety for me that there needs to be this coherent thesis, and really what that comes down to is whether I can convince people that it's a coherent thesis. So thank you for listening. Feedback, questions, very, very welcome. If you want the slides, I've made some videos of some of the narratives which I've voiced up with drama students. They're really interesting. I've got some data if anyone wants to have a go at some of the analysis and make sure I'm being objective. So just drop me an email, and there are the main references. But again, anything I've mentioned in here that you'd like, please let me know. Thank you.